Hello, welcome. We are talking politics and religion without killing each other. I'm your host, Corey Nathan. It's an honor to be a part of the Democracy Group. That's a network of podcasts that examines what's broken in our democracy, how we can work together to fix it. So thankful to the Village Square and to Mesa Wealth Management. Those are our sponsors. Check them out. We have links in the show notes. They really do help us continue to do the work that we're doing. In addition to some of the folks that are our paid subscribers on Substack, consider that as well. Carl and I were just talking about that before we hit record, getting much more active on Substack at coreysnathan.substack.com. That's COREYSSSAM check us out over there. Subscribe if you're so inclined. Paid subscriber is great. Pays for the editing and all the different things that we got to do here. Anyway, let's get right to it. I am so happy to be joined today again by my friend. He's become my friend over this last year or so, Carl Allen. Carl Allen is a researcher and an analyst of sports and political data. His current research interests include inefficiencies in political betting markets and improving polling methods. We talked last year about his awesome book, his eye-opening book, his epiphany-inducing book, The Polls Weren't Wrong, and really digging more into his Substack, actually, which we'll be talking about today. It's so good to see you again, Carl. How you doing?
Hey, man, it's great to be back. Thanks so much for having me. Always a pleasure to get in touch. Like you said, we've kept in touch kind of off of podcasting too. So this is always a fun conversation to have.
So last year, I had a Substack, but I haven't been as active. Literally in August, a switch just flipped for me, and I decided to start writing more regularly, really crafting what I was doing there. Have you been? I was going through your Substack. Have you been as active since the last time we talked before the elections last year, or have you ramped it up in this last year or so?
Yeah, I've been extremely active on Substack. One of my goals is not necessarily to write more, but it's to get my thoughts out of my head onto paper, and hopefully it resonates with people. Obviously, the book that I finished last year was a big, big project. I had a very stiff deadline, obviously, with the election. But as I've been writing more, I've been kind of finding my voice. I do not confuse myself with a gifted writer by any means, but I absolutely love teaching. I love learning. And some of the things that I talk about on my Substack are very data oriented, but it's presented in a way that I hope anybody that wants to understand it can understand it. I talk about sports data. I talk about political data. I talk about my research. I talk about other people's research. Right now, I'm working on an article regarding the match fixing scandal in the MLB. Well, it wasn't match fixing. It was pitch fixing.
Literally like first ball strike or first ball ball or something like that, right?
Yeah, absolutely. So
I was looking at that dude's stats. What's his name? The closer for
Class A, yeah.
Class A. My mind is blown because this guy is legit one of the top relievers in baseball over the last 5 years. I didn't realize how good he was until I started digging into the stats. I know you and I look at somewhat different stats, but listen, when you got a whip under one, maybe that's a stat that we can agree on. That's for his career under one. That's next level, dude. And he threw it all away. We'll never see him pitch again in the major leagues.
It's honestly remarkable given the fact that he signed a pretty good He was probably worth more money than he got in his contract. But let's be honest, he was making something like $10 million a year for the next several years. And the amount of money that he got from, I didn't know when I started writing the article, all the details, but it's come out that it was talking like thousands of dollars per game.
Even if it was $50,000.
That's a great amount of money. But when you have millions of dollars on the line, this it just doesn't make any sense. So back through 2020, I actually worked for Major League Baseball. I was a game day data reporter. The data that I observed was used by some other organizations, including Major League Baseball, to keep track of lots of things. But one of the things that they were always on alert for was match fixing. Match fixing, which is kind of manipulating the over-under, manipulating who wins, is relatively easy to detect. Because it's a pretty large sample of data. But when we're getting into individual events, that's where there's a huge red flag for me as kind of someone who enjoys gambling, but also sees the potential for the markets to be manipulated.
Right.
When you can bet on individual events like this, to Classe and to the other Ortiz, who was also involved in this,
Yeah.
allegedly, I guess still, I don't know. But the pitchers who were involved in this, to them, they're like, oh, we're not throwing the game. We're not doing anything that bad. It's just one pitch.
Right.
And I think about NFL and even college football. You can bet on whether the next play will be a run or a pass.
Yeah.
Like some of these things that don't even impact the outcome of the game. So, like old school match fixing usually was organized around point shaving, basically slowing down the game to manipulate the over under. Well, now you can bet on individual events. These things are extremely hard to detect. And I guess fortunately, these guys were pretty blatant and dumb about it.
Yeah.
And got caught. But thinking kind of as a data person and as someone who analyzes these things both for fun and for work, there's so much potential for manipulation of these markets that I would highly recommend just getting rid of them across the board because there's just too many moving parts and too many ways for people to get in trouble.
Now, when you were working for, we're getting way off track here, but this is super interesting. In fact, now that I think about it, we have a new show called East Meets West Sports. So I might just air this on the new RSS feed because this is really we were talking about this actually today. My co-host Rick Garcia and I. But when you were working for MLB, was there already a clause in your? I don't know if you had an official contract or if you were an at-will employee, but there was something that you cannot absolutely positively no betting on baseball, right?
Absolutely not. It was non-negotiable, kind of absolutely no betting on the sport in any way, even if it wasn't the games I was involved with, et cetera. And that I think is a good policy.
Yeah.
I have friends who still work in professional sports who I go very far out of my way to avoid talking about anything specific about the players and their performance and, hey, how is this guy looking? Even honestly inquisitive things I'm interested in, that can be considered inside information. They can get in trouble for it. It's not worth it. And
in a lot of ways, we're relying on the integrity of the individual players and the individual employees of all the different leagues. Are there other ways of enforcing the integrity of the game?
That's where you need good data analysts to come in and be able to say this action appears legitimate. This is just a one-off kind of thing versus this appears to be a consistent manipulation of an organized group with the purpose of winning some bet or something like that. But ultimately, and again, when it comes to large-scale match fixing, who wins, who loses, the over-under, these things require usually lots of people, but if not lots of people, it requires one person doing a lot of work. But with a sport like baseball, if you can bet on an individual event, first pitch is a strike or a ball, in the NFL or college football, the next play is a run or a pass. That is a sliver of inside information that people can feasibly have that if the people who are attempting to manipulate these markets are smart about it, probably wouldn't be able to get caught.
Yeah.
So again, I think the solution here is not to outlaw gambling. I've heard a lot of people saying we should outlaw gambling. It's kind of double-edged sword because if you outlaw gambling, that means there are fewer regulations, there's less oversight, which means it's harder to catch these bad actors.
Yeah.
I think the solution that we need to move towards is to just get rid of, ban these individual event, pitch by pitch, play by play style things. I know. I think the Major League Baseball negotiated like a maximum bet that you can place on these things, and I guess that helps. But at the end of the day, I think we need to kind of step back and say there's a potential for manipulation here. There's not that much incentive to provide this additional market other than getting people addicted to it. And if we get rid of those markets, there's still plenty to bet on. Oh, my God. You can bet on so much stuff on any given game and still have fun with it and without that potential for manipulation.
So you're play recreationally, and you've had a pretty good success here. As I've watched, you measure certain months, but for you, it's more
Mhm.
probabilistic. So you're looking for gaps, if you will, in
Mhm.
how you're calculating the odds for a certain event to happen, and you set you within ranges. You've calculated a certain range. So if you're getting 8 to 10% returns, you're having a pretty good month. How do you arrive at those choices in terms of figuring out the math on it, finding maybe certain soft spots in what the odds that are being put out there, or are
Yeah,
you are you always betting against someone else on the other side of the bet?
right. So my kind of advancement into being a professional sports bettor has been entirely accidental. I started betting for fun after I had left my job with Major League Baseball, and I started betting baseball, kind of normal stuff, over under, who wins, mostly for fun. I
Yeah,
would do some I would do some analysis and things like that, but for the most part, I was just betting for fun. But as I had a little bit more time on my hands, I started doing my own analysis. Mainly, it was for forecasting player performance, as in which players do I think are undervalued. This is kind of the typical stuff that a front office analytics team does.
right.
Who's undervalued, who's overvalued. Ironically, and this is hilarious that we've just talked about him, Class A was extremely high on my list of players who were undervalued back in 2018 or 2019 when he got traded for Corey Kluber, who was a good starting pitcher, but he was kind of expensive, whereas Class A was a very young pitcher who I thought was kind of a can't miss reliever, very good relieving prospect. That's how it started.
Yeah,
It evolved into finding, because there were so many more markets coming available as the number of sports books grew, I started looking into high frequency and low frequency events and kind of in simpler terms, looking at the edges of the bell curve. Because what happens when you get to the edges of the bell curve, if an event is truly 99% to happen, but the markets price it at, say, 97% to the average person, I would say, and I don't like talking down to people who maybe don't study statistics, but I would say maybe to the average person, that looks like, okay, 97% to 99%, there's a 2% edge there. But to the better investor, someone who looks at the numbers probabilistically, that small edge, even though it's
yeah,
a small return on your money, that money you're putting into this single event, you're getting your money back, you're reinvesting it. So instead of a long-term investment, how we normally think of investments, right? Like the stock market, we put this money in there, let it sit, and it grows over time. We're making a little bit of money, a lot, over and
right.
over.
Yeah,
And then there's the other, and then as I found out, there's even, and that edge of the bell curve is more about political betting. So I started researching political betting before it was legal in the US. Prediction markets and even regular sports betting is legal in UK, Australia. I worked with some folks over there on their elections, setting odds and things like that. As it became legalized in the US, even very recently in the 2025 elections, the governor's races and the mayoral race in New York City, I had a lot of people asking me questions. Hey, Carl, what do you think? What are the odds of this happening? And on that side of the bell curve, you're making very large investments for a small return, but it's a quick turnaround.
yeah,
In sports, I'm looking at the other side of the bell curve, very infrequent events. In baseball, I bet home runs. In football, I bet touchdowns. And for simplicity's sake, touchdowns are quite rare events. And I'm betting players who rarely, if ever in their career, have scored touchdowns. And I've found a small edge in there. So I've been doing that. I've been posting that for 5 or so years on my social media. I used to do it on X. I'm transitioning to Threads. It's a little bit more compatible with what I do when I say, hey, these are the players that I'm betting. This is how much I'm betting. I don't ask people to follow me for that reason. It's just one of many things that I do where I just want a track record for what I have done. And I've used Substack in that way as well for political forecasting and things like that.
So we've gone down a rabbit hole here. We haven't started talking about politics yet, but I have to tease
Yeah.
this out just for a second. I don't know if this is exactly how it works, but I'm going to give you an illustration. Talking about home runs. So I'm a diehard New York Mets fan. And if Pete Alonso, he's now the all-time home run leader for the franchise in New York Mets. He just passed Darryl Strawberry in July or August of this year. But we know, based on his 7 years in the major leagues, it's a really good likelihood that he's going to hit somewhere between 35 and 40 home runs, maybe plus or minus, say, you know,
5,
10,
10,
5 or
something like
10
that.
max.
Yeah.
Yeah. But
Sure.
realistically, somewhere in that 35 to 40 range, which means there's about a 20 to 25% chance on any single game because it's 162 games. So there's about a
Yep.
20 to 25% chance that he's going to hit a home run any single game. So for me, if I'm getting odds that are better than 5 to 1 that he'll hit a home run, I'm going to
Mhm.
take those odds. Is that a good way to look at it?
That is a good starting point. That is
Okay.
a very good starting point. The reason I would caution against saying he hits this many home runs in a season, therefore this game, is that is a bit of an oversimplification. You're taking large scale data and trying to apply it to an individual event. I think that's called dicto simpliciter, where you have a large amount of data and you try to say, therefore, in this specific circumstance, this is probably what will happen. In baseball, as you know, matchups matter.
Yeah.
Um,
So the odds are going to go up and down based on the starting pitcher that day.
oh, buddy, let me. If you want to go down the rabbit hole, it depends on the starting pitcher.
Oh,
It
and the
depends on
ballpark?
depends on the ballpark. It depends on the weather. It depends on who is available out of the bullpen. It depends on the umpire
Okay.
behind the plate. Umpires with wider strike
Yeah.
zones,
Okay.
less favorable to certain players. It depends on the pitch types the pitcher throws, where they throw it in the zone versus
Yeah.
where the hitter likes the ball in the zone. The best example that I can give of that is that pitchers who throw the ball low in the zone to fly ball hitters who hit a large number of fly balls, have an advantage. There's also the platoon advantage, left versus right on right. There's a lot of data that goes into it. You can use the over under in the game as a proxy for all of those intangibles.
Yeah.
But I found that for specific player matchups, even who is batting behind them in the lineup has a factor, because if you have a Pete Alonso followed by another right-handed hitter versus Pete Alonso versus a left-handed with a left-handed hitter hitting behind him, he's more likely to get walked later in the
Mm.
game with a left-handed pitcher on the mound. So there's a little bit more that goes into it. But what you're getting at is actually kind of an answer to your last question,
Yeah.
which was how do I analyze this data? What am I looking for? What data matters versus what data people think matters. Wherever there's a disconnect in what data, first of all, what data there is,
Yeah.
right? In most circumstances, we all have access to basically the same data. Major League Baseball is no exception. I don't have any special data that everyone couldn't get access to. But looking at things like pitching matchups, bullpen advantages, the umpire in the game, things like that. In baseball, I found a kind of a marginal edge in that. In baseball, it's such a grind. It's 162 games. So every single game, if I'm actively trying to find an edge, it becomes tiresome.
Yeah.
NFL is very fun for me. NFL is very, very fun for me because I can work on Saturday, do a little prep work, Sunday, game day, get my bets in, and then hopefully making a little bit of money on Sunday. Only one game Monday, take the rest of the week off. I absolutely love doing things like that because it keeps my mind sharp when it comes time to analyze political data. To me, political forecasting and sports data are just a continuum of kind of the same thing. These are events where we have some data, but we don't have all the data. In
Yeah.
sports, we have a huge sample size of data. For example, in a baseball season, 162 games, you can pretty well figure out how good of a sports bettor you are if you're betting across the full season. In elections, we only get one election every 2 to 4 years. So it could take a lifetime
Yeah.
of sample size to figure out who the best forecasters are. who the best pollsters are. And I think we'll probably talk about that a
Yeah.
little bit later. But once we start getting into what data matters versus what data people think matters, you can start to identify some potential. If you're interested in identifying an edge, then you can. But for me, on the educational side of things, when I'm trying to teach people that these gaps in our understanding present uncertainty, and we have to be able to quantify that in some way other than it probably doesn't matter, or we can just assume something about it and pretend it doesn't exist.
Yeah. All right. So 20 minutes in, that's a good segment. I might just take this whole segment and put it over on my East Meets West Sports podcast. I'll have to ask Rick to make sure, but that might happen. It's a really good. So let's reset a little bit about your background and a little bit about specifically political polling, forecasting, et cetera. So right at we talked about this last year, but if you could share, when did it first start occurring to you that the way so many people, including professional pundits, use polls is completely wrong?
Yeah. If your listeners, and I'm going to get this out of the way early, if your listeners take nothing else from whatever hour long we talk from me, please let it be this. Polls are not predictions of election outcomes. That does not sound deeply profound. I understand that it does not sound deeply profound, but that simple statement, polls are not predictions of election outcomes, contradicts the worldwide consensus of analysts in the field, statisticians, political scientists, pundits. They all perform analysis that assumes that a poll, if accurate, will predict the election outcome. That overarching fundamental belief is not correct. It is a foundational belief that is incorrect. I started researching political polls right around 2020 when COVID hit, and I was trying to work with sports data, and there was none. So I started getting into political data, not because I believed I could find some edge. A lot of my followers will laugh when I say this, but I followed Nate Silver very closely, and I believed he knew everything that there was to know about political forecasting and polls. I did not start doing research with the goal of disproving anyone, with the goal of making any novel discovery. I started researching political data because I was bored, and I am not very fun. So I tried to build my own. 2020 was my first time trying to build my own forecast. Like most people, I started with poll data. I had a really crappy model, Markov chain, where I said, if this, then this, if this, then this. There was some good stuff in there, but I wasn't ready to say my work is better than anyone else's. What ended up happening when I first had my original 2020 model, I started reaching some different conclusions than Nate Silver and some of the consensus analysts. Now, if you remember, 2020 was not the big contentious election. That was 2016, Hillary Clinton and Trump. Right. 2020 was my first time actually trying to build a forecast. And what I was finding was some inconsistencies with what I believed to be true, mainly a state like Maine, which most people didn't care about. But in Maine, Joe Biden was polling in the low to mid 50s, and Trump was in the low to mid 40s. And there wasn't really a whole lot of room for him to come back. Nate Silver had Donald Trump as a 10% chance to win Maine, which again, 10% doesn't sound like much. But if we're talking,
but you had so just as an example, you had in this last election, 2025, you had about a 10% chance of Mikey Sherrill winning by the amount that she won. Not that you had like a 90-something% that she'd win, but a 10% chance by the margin that she actually won, which is significant. 10% is significant as opposed to, now let me guess, because I've read your book and I read your Substack. So the 50 plus of a chance, he was polling in the over 50, and then Trump was. So a few of my questions is 50 what and 40 what, and how close to
Yeah.
100 does it add up to? Even still, anything over 50 is significant
Is
because that
very
gives him
significant.
a much, there's you 50 plus one is what he needs. So if you're
Yes.
putting a percentage on whether he's going to win, so if it's say 55% and the margin of error is 4, which would be a
Yes.
relatively big margin of error, you're going to put
Hmm.
like a pretty damn close to 100% chance that he's going to win Maine. Is that right?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. So my original forecast had it at some small decimal under 1%. As I've gotten a little bit better, I'm saying, okay, we can't be quite that certain, but my forecast would have had Joe Biden as a 99% plus favorite. So 1% versus 10%,
Big
we're
difference.
talking, yes. So if we're talking about betting here, that's the difference between getting 10 to 1 odds and 100 to 1 odds
Right.
that something happens. So that was kind of my first, okay, what am I missing? Because again, as confident as I may sound today, 5 years after I started
Yeah.
doing research on this topic and a year after publishing my book, I was not overly confident. My default assumption was that I was missing something, that I was doing something wrong. And I think that's fair. Anyone who listens to me or reads what I write, you don't know me. You know that you maybe know I don't have a PhD in political science. So if your default assumption is that I'm going to side with the current consensus versus what Carl says, totally understandable. I am not saying you should assume that I'm correct. What I'm saying is almost anyone is qualified to read what I write and read what the field's consensus is and compare it back and forth. And they say, okay, Carl says polls are not predictions of election outcomes. The experts say we can compare the margin of the poll to the margin of the election, and the difference is the poll's error, which is implicitly saying that the poll, if it is accurate, will predict the election result. And at that fundamental level, I think any person, whether or not you're educated, highly educated in statistics or not, can see the disconnect here. And these are irreconcilable. These
Yeah.
are irreconcilable differences. This is not something where we can come together, find a compromise, find a happy medium. And that's where I found difficulty in my work. So as I worked backwards, so I started doing back testing for the 2016 election. And what my model would have said for the 2016 election is that Hillary Clinton was a strong favorite. She was not a 90% favorite. She was not a 99% favorite, as some analysts said. 60 to 70 to 80% is our entirely fair range, right?
Yeah.
I think Nate Silver's model gave her something like a 70% chance.
Yeah. Close to
Entirely
670.
fair
Yeah.
range.
Yeah.
Entirely fair range. Absolutely. And the disconnect here, and one of the reasons that I think he does deserve credit for his work in 2016 is that he was quantifying uncertainty properly in that, yes, Hillary is ahead in the polls. Yes, she is a favorite, but just because she's up by 5 in all of these swing states or up by 3 or whatever the number was, there's still too much uncertainty because of undecided voters and third party voters that we can't say that she is a heavy favorite.
Mm-hmm.
And he deserves a ton of credit for that. But I give credit where it's due, and I really want to give criticism where it's due also. Remember, he kind of rose to fame. His platform and his public perception grew after the 2008, 2012 Obama years, where he said, no, it's not a toss-up. Obama's a heavy favorite, and then Obama won.
Right.
The narrative around that was Nate Silver predicted who will win. And this is where we have to get into the difference between predictions and forecasts. Predictions and forecasts. A prediction is who will win, team A or team B, Republicans or Democrats. This is an inappropriate way to think about probabilistic uncertainty. And again, to his credit, after 2016, Nate Silver said, hey, I don't deserve all of this criticism. All I said was Hillary Clinton was favored. I didn't say she was going to win. But then you go back to when he was getting all of this adulation for predicting all 50 states, for calling the election result, there was no comparable pushback. And bringing this all together to our talk about integrity and in sports, in forecasting, in science, and in statistics, if you want people to trust you, you have to be consistent. You have to be correct.
Yeah.
I think. You have to admit when you're wrong. That's a big one. That's a big one. for any reputable analyst, statistician, scientist, pundit. I think you have to be able to admit when you're wrong, but you have to be able to be consistent in, you can't take praise for something and say, well, that's not exactly right, but it makes me look good. And then later, when that same logic of, well, you said Hillary was favored and she didn't win, therefore your forecast was bad, you can't push back then, because that, again, undermines your integrity.
So in your work, one of your consistent emphases is the way that folks are talking about spreads. So for example, if a poll comes back, and first of all, a lot of folks just aren't considering the margin of error nearly as much as we should be. But I love your graphs because there are different shades, and you list percentages. So I'll get to that in a second. But first, the spreads. Oftentimes, if folks are looking at polls, they're saying, "Oh, well, Mikey Sherrill is polling at say 49%, and Ciccarelli, I forget how you say his name, Citarelli is polling at 42%." Yeah.
Citrelli, yeah.
Citrelli. So he's polling at 42. So there's a 7-point spread or whatever it was. I don't remember what the numbers were, but they look at this is where she's polling. This is where he's polling. It's that, whatever the difference is, she's ahead by 5 points or 7 points, whatever it is. In her case, I think she was consistently polled. People were talking about she's only ahead by 2 points or 3 points in her case. Spanberger was a little bit further ahead, but you hate that spread. You hate talking about it like spread. So break that down for me. How should we be looking at it?
Spread is a remarkably misleading metric because not all spreads are created equal.
Yeah.
If we want to simplify poll data, there are better ways to do it.
Yeah.
We can talk about the leading candidate's poll number, such as Cheryl is polling at 48%, 49%. The spread, in our mind, we reach this conclusion of, if this poll is accurate, if these poll averages are accurate, then that's kind of about within the margin of error what the election result will be. But we're leaving out some very, very important variables in this process. We have to be able to account for uncertainty.
Yeah.
And uncertainty is voters who are undecided, and especially in non-US elections, but as we talk about the New York City mayoral election, we'll get into it. Also, third party people who in the poll say they support a third party candidate. This was especially true in 2016. The reason the narrative around 2016 is so flawed is because the two confounding variables between the poll and the election, which are the number of undecided voters, and the number and political leaning of third party voters.
Right.
Those were both larger than normal in number, so analysts really struggled to quantify that uncertainty. So when we talk about the spread, it is an oversimplified metric that feels good, it feels right, because all else equal, yes, it is better to be up by more than not. I would not argue that in a two-candidate race, 44, well, no, I can't even say that, honestly. Let me scratch that.
Okay.
Even in the simplest possible race, even in a simplest possible race in which there are only two candidates, such as, let's say, California Prop 50.
Right. Yes or no.
The options are yes or no. There is no
third party,
when it comes
maybe.
To election day.
Yeah.
There is no maybe. There is no other. But before the election, we are dealing with a three-dimensional problem. We have undecided and yes and no.
Right.
So we have to be able to understand that when we take a poll, the number of people who say yes, plus or minus some margin of error, is how they would respond right now. No, plus or minus some margin of error, and undecided, plus or minus some margin of error. When we take the spread from a poll, and we say yes is up by 12, let's say. This poll says yes is up by 12. Up by 12 can be a huge range of things. Up by 12 can be 50 to 38.
32 to 20.
32 to 20. 55 to 43. up by 12 can mean too many different things for us to look at that one data point and say, that's the data point that is most important. Because what we're doing, and this is a deterministic versus probabilistic reasoning problem, is that when you assign an unconditional probability to undecided voters, meaning in the United States, the consensus of analysts says undecided voters will probably split about evenly. And that is a satisfactory assumption that they use to inform all of their analysis about poll error. They use the spread. Right. And that unconditional probability being assumed is a major violation of some basic rules of statistics, but they don't really, I guess, understand that that's what they're doing. When they're saying, people who are undecided will probably split about evenly. Why? Why do you think that that's the default assumption? Why is it not possible that a larger percentage will support the option that is ahead? Is it not possible that sometimes in some elections, the majority of voters who are undecided will support the option that is not ahead? There's so much more to the problem than this. And remember, this is the simplest problem. This is with only two candidates, right? This is only yes or no, A or B, Democrat, Republican. This is a simple problem. So, now apply this same reasoning to an election with 3, 4, or 5 viable candidates, as we often see with primaries. Right. And then you get into what I'm writing about and what I'm trying to have published in more academic circles, which is, why is primary error, the error in primary polls so much higher than in general election polls? Well, in a primary, the candidates are ideologically very similar. Thus, it is more likely that an individual might change from candidate A to candidate C to candidate B than in a two-party election where the options are yes or no, very different. And in the cases where voters are undecided, it is really, really hard to figure out which of the 2, 3, 5 viable candidates they will eventually choose. So this misunderstanding or this misapplication of polls as predictions of election results has wide-ranging implications for the field. For me, I care about the science part of it. I care about the education part of it and how students are being misinformed. But I'm told by people in the field that I need to start promoting my work more on the fact that people are literally losing their jobs because their polls are not accurate enough. Right. Based on this pseudoscientific metric, people are literally losing funding and their jobs because by this metric that says polls are predictions, which they're not, their polls weren't accurate enough. And I do see, like, there's so much to this problem and it can be solved. But it requires, I have tried to rationalize, I've tried to compromise, I've tried to come up with a better way to explain it. But this foundation of polls as predictions, saying the spread of the poll, if the poll is accurate, should predict the spread of the election, this belief is foundationally flawed. It has to be entirely gotten rid of. Well, your race analogy, the picture you showed where you take a picture of an actual race, whatever it is, a 400-yard, one lap around the thing. And we don't know exactly where in the race it takes place, but one of the runners is, say, 5 yards in the lead. But if it's at the first turn, that makes a big difference as to, it's not a predictor. It's just it's literally a picture in time. Now that runner in the lead could pull a hammy. There could be, pictures in the middle of the race of her with whatever, So I have a question for you. I didn't realize, but what you just talked about made me realize that the redistricting, speaking of Prop 50, the redistricting is built on a lot of assumptions that can't necessarily be made. And I think Mike Madrid has been hinting at this, that not only have assumptions been made about how independent voters will end up and making basic assumptions that they'll be evenly split, but
in Texas, they're going a step further, and they're assuming that votes that were assigned a certain way in these newly drawn districts will go that same way in future elections. So those assumptions are really bad assumptions, I guess. Is that a fair assertion that I've just
I
drawn from everything that you've just talked about?
Yeah. So the people who have worked on elections for as many years as they have, and all of the math that underlies gerrymandering
Yeah.
are literally people doing things similar to what I do and looking at the probabilities of voters' participation, turnout, and preference, right? So
Yeah.
they can quantify all of these things within a margin of error. And every safe district that you draw, say you're pretty confident that the candidate that you want to win in this gerrymandered district will win by 20 or more. Even in a bad year, they should still win by 10. It's a safe district. But what happens is the safer you draw that district, the less safe some of these other districts are.
Right.
So there are feasible gerrymanders in states like California and Texas where you can almost hack um, voters for the party that you do not want to win into one or two or three districts. But you're doing that, it's kind of a measured risk at that point, because if you have a bad year, what you thought was a safe district becomes not so safe. What you thought was a lean district becomes the other party, and there's kind of a domino effect there. So how safe you draw those districts really is determined by the quality of work that your analysts are doing. And
Yeah.
yes, it is built upon assumptions within a margin of error that in a good year versus in a bad year versus in a normal median year, what that range of outcomes
That
might
makes
look
sense.
like.
So in order to draw a R plus 10 district in certain districts in Texas, or an R plus D plus 10 in California,
Mm-hmm.
it
Mm-hmm.
necessarily means that you might be taking an R plus 15 and turning it into an R plus 8 or an R plus
Yeah.
6.
Yep.
So
Absolutely.
the election that we just saw here a couple of weeks ago, 2020, a week ago now, as we record this, we saw the level of spread, sorry, the level of wins
Mm-hmm.
that were, R plus 60. I mean, like that level of
Yeah.
a wave turns those,
Yeah.
those R plus sixes or R plus eights or even R plus tens into coin flips, don't they?
Yes. Yep, absolutely. And I want to clarify here. When I talk about spread as a metric, the reason that I don't like spread is because it's treated as a predictive metric,
Right.
and it's not. You can use spread in
Once the
elections
election
for
happens.
once the election is over. Yeah, this candidate won by this much. Yes, the election spread is a valid metric to use for how much that candidate won by. But in a poll, the spread is not valid to say how much this candidate is ahead by,
Right.
because you're making some uh, unconditional assumptions about undecided voters, about third party voters that don't usually, always, or ever hold true.
Right.
So I wanted to just clarify that. But yes, you are exactly right that in a wave type of year, when you have these districts that seem mostly safe, there are different variables that are less predictable than others. In 2024, we saw that young men voted Republican by, it's not by any means outside the margin of error of what anyone expected, but it was very much on the high end of what most analysts would have forecasted. So when we're talking about voters who have recently switched affiliations, black men, young men, Hispanic voters, whoever the case may be, that they used to support one candidate, they're the traditional swing voters. If you assume that you will keep their support going forward, there's a lot more movement that can happen in districts like that,
Right.
opposed to where I live in Ohio. That's not to say there's not swing voters here, but the rural versus urban divide is pretty easily quantified. More so, I think, in Ohio than it might be in a state like Texas or even California.
So I thought we were going to spend the entire time talking about the following, but
Okay.
we'll cover it. But there's so much else to talk about. First of all, I love the way you illustrate the forecasts.
Yeah.
I love how you're emphasizing the difference between forecasts and polls and how you're using polls to generate
Hmm.
forecasts. So as an
Yeah.
example, just the one the New Jersey governor's race that you assigned a win probability. I think this was I don't see the date on here. November 3rd. So
Yeah.
this is just a couple days before the election. Win probability: Mikey Sherrill 91.6%,
Sure.
Citarelli 8.4%, other 0%. But this is
Yeah.
what I love. This is what I
Yeah.
love. Cheryl outcome ranges. She loses 8.4%, wins by 0 to 2.5%, 14.6%, wins by 2.5 to 5%, 24. Excuse me, wins by 2.5 to 5 points. That's a 24.5% range. Wins by
Hmm.
5 to 10. That was your biggest one.
Yep.
41.4% chance that she wins by 5 to 10 points. Wins
Hmm.
by 10 plus 10.9%, which she ultimately won, I
Yep.
think, by 13
Like
the last.
almost, yeah, almost 14. Hmm.
Yeah.
Just under 14.
Yeah, so that gives it tells me that these are the probabilities, and this is the range of probabilities. I love looking at things that way. Now, you're able to keep sort of a much more nuanced, detailed picture in mind. It's easier for folks to hang on to. Oh, she's ahead by 6 points, whatever.
Yes.
But given that, and you were seeing things, were you taken? Were you taken by surprise by the final result just in this one, let alone the other ones?
I think that was probably the most surprising election for me. Just because she performed, it was just like a very easy, no sweat kind of
She hit a two
victory.
outer.
Yeah, I mean, it was pretty remarkable the margin that she won by. But what I think was even more remarkable, and maybe we can talk about this when we get to New York as well. But the turnout in New Jersey was so high. Like, yes, everybody kind of expected this would be a higher than average turnout
Yeah.
for New Jersey. But I believe Cheryl got something like 1.9 million votes. The Republican candidate got something like 1.4 million votes. In 2021, 1.4 million votes would have won.
Mm,
And he didn't even come close. And you can and maybe fact check me on that. I'm pretty sure that that's correct. But turnout was up so much
yeah.
that even a very impressive performance in terms of raw votes was not even close to competitive in the election result. And this kind of speaks to it was kind of similar to 2020 if you think about it, because Joe Biden got what 82 million votes in the popular vote.
Yeah.
Donald Trump got something like 75 million, and I think both were like first and second place
Yeah.
for popular vote because turnout was so high. Like,
Right.
yeah, normally it's like in a baseball game. If you say, well, this team scored 10 runs, you would say, yeah, they probably won. But sometimes both teams, both parties do really, really well, and they still don't come close to winning.
Yeah.
And so one of the ways that I try to help people understand this kind of range of probabilities is understanding that when we're talking about an uncertain future event, whether for me, like I said, sports and politics are kind of a continuum of the spectrum here, right? In sports, we're trying to quantify human performance. In politics, we're trying to quantify human activity, which is voting. And both are very uncertain. It is
Yeah.
very, very hard to quantify this within I mean, like you pointed out, I said there was about an 8% chance that she lost
Right.
and about a 10% chance that she won by 10 or more. People want to know the answer. When people talk to me about political stuff, they say, who's going to win? That's what they want to know. But getting back to that integrity topic, anyone who claims to know the answer in advance of the election doesn't know the answer. They can be confident, and
Yeah.
sometimes that confidence will be on the right side of correct. But in the long run, somebody's going to claim to be 100% certain about something, and then it won't happen.
So,
So being able to distinguish between these highly likely and almost certain,
yeah.
because I do that a lot in sports betting when I'm betting touchdowns, when I'm talking about in any other field, the number of nines after the decimal matters, right? 99.9 versus 99.99,
Yeah. Big
that
difference.
matters.
Yeah.
If you're running a website or you're doing a safety inspection or any number of different things. But I think being able to quantify that and understanding that uncertainty, it makes us uncomfortable. Like talking about politics and religion makes us
It
uncomfortable.
does. Yeah.
Talking about uncertainty makes people really uncomfortable because they want to know what will happen, and it's understandable.
So
Political
what
outcomes matter, but we have to become a little bit more comfortable with not knowing with certainty.
so what were some of your biggest takeaways from the results of last week's election?
Um, High turnout is by
That's
far
the
the
interesting.
number one thing that
Okay.
I took away from it. None of the results were crazy outlier enough to be like, oh man, I can't believe this happened. I'm sure there was something somewhere that happened that if I had done more research on it, I was only really following
The big
the
ones, yeah.
governor, the
So
mayor of
just as an
NYC.
example, you assigned 31.5% chance that Prop 50 wins by over 20 points. So that's a pretty
Right.
healthy percentage
Yeah.
that you were assigning to it. The only one that was bigger was the possibility that it would win by between 10 and 20 points, which you assigned a 46.8% chance. But between
Yeah.
10 and 20 and 20 or 20 plus,
And it
that
won
was,
by what? Didn't it win by almost 30, I think. It was like
yeah,
28 or something
about
like that.
six. I think the last time I checked was about 64%
Yeah.
voted in favor. So yeah, I mean, there wasn't a ton of things that took you by surprise. That 10.9% chance of Mike and Cheryl winning by over 10
Mhm.
points. But 10 is still significant. 10,
It's huge.
yeah, it's significant. It's not 1%. It's not 0.1%. It's significant. Now this is way early, way early. What are you looking for as the 2026 election starts to unfold? Are there certain trends that you're going to be looking for? Are there certain states that you're going to be studying? What are you going to be paying
Yep.
attention to?
Absolutely. I mean, the Senate is obviously the biggest um, thing to measure because you have to remember, even though states are independent, politics are national. So when Democrats have a good night, when Democrats do really well in Virginia and New Jersey, Prop 50 out in California hadn't the results hadn't even started coming in yet, but immediately, and I didn't have a live forecast, I don't have a needle, I don't have anything that fancy, but if I were live updating all of my forecasts based on that data that came in from the East Coast, I would have said I think the yes, which is the Democrat favorable side in California, is probably instead of 10 to 20 being my most favorable range, I would have nudged it up to probably 15 to 25 or something like that. But when we're talking about 2026, gerrymandering is huge.
Mm.
How many House districts are going to be favorable to Democrats versus Republicans? How many seats are even going to be competitive? Because one of the things, just in my, I guess you could call it just kind of my belief system, is the House of Representatives should be representative. It
Yeah,
should be reflective of the country. But what gerrymandering does is it takes all of that power away from voters. Instead of voters picking their leaders, the leaders are picking their voters. And so we're taking what should be, we have 435 House seats, what should be, say, 200 to 250 competitive races. We're dealing with 20 to 30
yeah,
competitive races
yeah.
because gerrymandering is so impactful on the value and power of people's votes. So I'm looking at that. That's a big factor. And then also the Senate races are big because the states that are up for election in 2026 are not favorable to Democrats. So
Ohio, Iowa,
yep,
Alaska are three states
Maine,
that
I
I've heard
believe.
might be in play if it's a Democratic wave. Um,
Yeah.
but
Mhm.
it would have to be a pretty big wave, I think. And it would
Yeah, I
also
mean,
be highly dependent on the candidates themselves.
exactly. And that's something that I think we learned this before this year, but especially this year, that good candidates are worth more than they used to be. It
Mm,
used to be it was Democrat versus Republican, people would show up. But even in federal elections, we saw the quality of candidates plays a major factor in how well they do in the election. Money still matters, just like in baseball. Spending more money gives you a better chance to win. But that's not the only factor. There's more to it than that. And in recent years, we've seen this the value of social media, the fact that people can get in front of a lot of people for not much money gives a platform, voice, and I'm going to be looking at that as well, who the candidates are. Living in Ohio, I believe we're going to have is Sherrod Brown running again?
Yeah,
I
Sherrod
think
Brown. Yeah.
he's so there's a lot of moving parts to this, and the fact that Sherrod Brown, for example, just one of the metrics that you can think about when you're forecasting, the fact that Sherrod Brown has won in Ohio before should give your starting point of his probability of winning being a little bit higher. He's
Yeah.
not a generic Democrat. He has high name recognition. He's won
Sa-
in Ohio before. He's been reelected in Ohio before.
Same
So
in
I
North
think that,
Carolina. The former governor, former Democratic governor, is running for
yep,
Senate in North Carolina.
yep,
So high
absolutely.
name recognition. Yeah, there's a lot of fundamental factors that give us at least a good starting point to start to figure out
Mhm.
what that race is going to. So we talked about baseball. We talked about so many different things. I literally have not looked at my outline because I knew we'd be able to have plenty to talk about. I just want to
Sure.
see. Definitely too early to start talking about 2028. I'm going to have you back a few times
Oh my God.
before we start talking about that. Okay. So you know what? Let's start to wrap it up. Um,
Sure.
uh, like I said, there's so much more to talk about, but I want to revisit our central question, the TP&R question. What do you think each of us can do to be able to share space with, have better conversations with, perhaps even nurture relationships with people across our differences? People, so that's people who get have different backgrounds than we do, have different beliefs than we do, get their news from different sources than we do. How can we do better at talking politics and religion without killing each other, or is it even possible?
One of the things that I value, one of the things that I believe is that spending time with people who are different than you, who believe things differently than you, gives you an appreciation for who they are as a person. And even without talking, and to answer your question, how can we talk politics and religion without killing each other? Talk about something other than politics and religion. That doesn't mean never talk about politics and religion. I am not in favor of that. I do think we should have these hard conversations. But talking about sports, talking about family, talking about our lives, our
Yeah.
jobs, our kids, things that we value, our hobbies, our interests, connecting with people on a deeper level gives you an appreciation for who they are as a person,
Yeah.
and it allows you to see them as someone who you can argue with, someone who you disagree with, someone who you dislike in many cases. But at the end of the day, you can understand, see where they're coming from, see what they value. And some of the things that I've noticed that people value are family, religion, and friends.
Yeah.
That's what they value in life. And I think a lot of people, at least two of those three things are important to them, right? And if not all three. And being able to understand where people are coming from, that they're trying to make their life better, their family's life better, their friends' lives better, and figuring out where you disagree and why, and filling in those gaps as you can.
That's really helpful. Other connecting points, talking from a values standpoint as opposed to a particular position or candidate standpoint, and establishing those connections first. That's a really good way to establish the relationship that transcends any particular issue where you might disagree. If it becomes, just a poop throwing contest, um, over Prop 50 or something like that, then
Yeah.
you're on very brittle ground. But if you start with the relationship and values, that's much more. I did want to ask you before we do wrap it up. So one poll I did want to ask you about post 2024 that really
Mhm.
threw me off for the Tuesday was Ann Seltzer's poll that came out of Iowa. I think it was the Saturday right before the election.
Yep.
Did you
Yep.
see that? And did you study that, analyze it?
Yes.
Is it
Yep.
fair to say I mean, that one really threw me off?
Yeah. Yeah. Based on the poll and the data that we have from between the poll into the election and then the actual election result, it seems pretty likely, seems highly likely that the poll was outside the margin of error.
Yeah.
And it's very, very, very important. And this is going back to quantifying uncertainty and things like that. I write about this a lot on my Substack. I talk about it in my book because it is one of the fundamental things that we must understand when we're talking about analyzing poll data, is that how certain can we be about any number of observations of things. Inferential statistics is the field that is the umbrella that political polling finds its data under. In my book, on my Substack, I write about this. I have coined a term called an ideal poll. An ideal poll means the only source of error in a poll is the margin of error itself, the random sampling error, the price we pay for taking a sample from a population instead of the whole population. Typically, political polls, the margin of error is plus or minus 3%, plus or minus 4%. The big question, and this is something that I present to people, hopefully in hopes of educating, that the margin of error does not apply to the spread of the election. It doesn't apply to the spread of the poll. The margin of error applies to each of the candidates in the poll and the number of voters who say they are undecided. So in Seltzer's poll, and I'm going from memory here, so I'm probably a little bit off, but I'm going to just say that she had Kamala Harris at 45%, Donald Trump at 43%, and undecideds around 10% with, say, 2% third parties, okay? If her margin of error was 4%, that means if she had taken a census instead of a poll, if she had asked everybody in the state of Iowa, or sorry, every registered voter in the state of Iowa, who do you plan to vote for in this election? That means her poll says that it should be 45% plus or minus 4% for Harris, 43% plus or minus 4% for Trump, 10% plus or minus. There's a bell curve here, so it's not quite 4% for undecideds. It's plus or minus, say, 2.5% for undecideds. That margin of error applies to each of those numbers at the time the poll was taken. Okay? Based on the election result, I think Donald Trump probably got to about 55 in Iowa. I don't have the data in front of me. There's not really enough undecided voters to explain that. I think Kamala Harris also slightly underperformed her poll number. Both of these are red flags for a genuine, measurable poll error. And here's where my work disconnects with the analysis done from people in the field. In statistics, we have this thing called false precision. False precision is claiming to be more certain than you can be about some piece of data, right? So I can assign a probability that her poll was outside the margin of error. Based on what I know from the election and the data I've seen, I would assign a high probability that her poll was outside the margin of error. But I cannot say that with certainty. No one can say that with certainty. And what's hard for us to understand is that a poll outside the margin of error does not mean she did anything wrong. Does not mean her poll was bad. Statistically speaking, 1 in 20 polls, if we're doing polls properly, right? If we take this ideal poll standard, which is a little bit simplified, but it is the benchmark by which political data derives its value. If we take a random sample, the only source of error is the margin of error itself. How often will our data fall within the margin of error? The answer is 95% of the time. 1 in 20 times our data will fall outside the margin of error. This is not a failure of statistics. This is a guarantee of it. That dealing with uncertainty that we just talked about, it's stressful for people. It bothers them.
Yeah.
So when you ask me to analyze a specific poll, I'm happy to do it. I do that for my own information, but we have to remember when it comes to political polls, there is no gold standard. We cannot say Atlas Intel or Gallup or Ann Seltzer or Rasmussen or this pollster is the best, because mathematically that is impossible. It is impossible for any pollster to be mathematically superior to another in human size lifetimes. We can't say that with any level of certainty, let alone the absolute certainty that people like Nate Silver say, oh, Atlas Intel was the most accurate pollster in 2020. Atlas Intel was the most, whatever we can't say that with certainty. That is the false precision that gives people this misunderstanding of how polls work. Going back to the very first thing I said, polls are not predictions of election outcomes. We use polls, if we can use polls, to inform a forecast for the range of possible outcomes, but we cannot say with certainty that a poll was outside the margin of error without a lot more data that we can't possibly have. And beyond that, understanding that that doesn't mean the poll was bad either. And this is where we're getting into people losing their jobs for things that are outside of their control. If we know mathematically, we can prove 1 in 20 polls, 5% of polls will be outside the margin of error. There's nothing you can do about it. Eat poo. That's math. There's nothing you can do about it. Okay? We know this mathematically. What is a pollster supposed to do about that problem? If they know that their accuracy is being judged on how well it predicts the outcome, but we have a probabilistic tool, which is a poll, plus or minus some margin of error, and we have a deterministic result, which is who wins, who loses, and we're comparing this tool, which gives us a probability. There is a 95% probability that this candidate currently is at this number plus or minus this number, and we're comparing that to an election result with confounders like undecideds, confounders like third-party voters changing their mind, and we're saying, too bad your poll was bad. I think that's poor science. It's very, very bad statistical practice. And at the fundamental level, again, there's this false precision that bothers me. There's so much about it that's problematic. I really want to be a part of the solution to fixing it. Part of that solution, a big part of that solution, is in my book. If you're interested in things that I have talked about, if it resonates with you, I am not a gifted speaker. I am not a gifted writer, but I mostly know what I'm talking about. And going to integrity, the process of science, if there's anything in my book that is incorrect, then I want to correct it. But the big picture, the biggest findings of my book and the biggest thesis of my book, that polls are not predictions of election outcomes, it's indisputable. But the problem is it's taught that way. The public thinks that way.
Yeah.
And our best scientific tools are being demeaned, which, as a domino effect, science in general is being demeaned. So we have to be able to quantify uncertainty better. We have to get out of this mindset of polls as predictions.
So what I'm taking from this is, if there's a photographer who took a picture of a 400-yard race when it was 100 yards in, and there was one runner that was way ahead who ended up losing, then we beat up the photographer and break the camera. Is that?
and the photographer loses their job because the snapshot was wrong. Again,
right.
I love analogies. All analogies are limited by the nature of analogies. The snapshot analogy is one of the best analogies that we can give to what does this poll data mean. If a poll were perfectly accurate, it could tell you with 100% accuracy what the state of the population is at some point prior to the election.
Yeah.
When I show people a snapshot of a foot race, I say this picture was taken 4 seconds before the runners crossed the finish line. Who does this snapshot predict will win the race? I usually get kind of a weird look. Like, what do you mean? I mean, this woman or this guy is ahead, so I would say more likely than not this person wins, but this isn't a really smart question. Who does this snapshot say will win the race? It's the same thing with polls. Who does this poll say will win? It's kind of a silly question. And then they take it a step farther and they say, not only does this poll supposed to tell us who wins, it's also supposed to tell us by how much they win, which, as you know, in a foot race, there are lots of variables that go into it. Some runners finish better than others. Some runners are in a better position than others. Some are coming from the outside versus being trapped behind another runner. There's so many variables that go into it. And we can quantify all of these things, whether it's a foot race, whether it's a political election. We can quantify all of these things. But it's very important that we do not mistake this tool in a foot race. We don't mistake this snapshot as a prediction of the race result. In an election, we do not mistake this poll as a prediction of the election result. They do not tell us who is ahead. They do not tell us by how much. They give us an idea but up by 2 points in the poll or up by 12 points, like the example we used earlier, how close are they to the finish line?
Yeah.
In an election with exactly two candidates, exactly two options, we know the finish line is at 50% plus one. How close are they to the finish line is a better answer or a better way to evaluate the data than how much the leader is up by.
Yeah.
As you read about in my book, it's hard to wrap our minds around, but some 2 point leads are better than 6 point leads. 49-47 in terms of probability of winning is better than 40-34.
Yep.
That 2 point lead is better than a 6 point lead.
In that instance. Yeah.
And the question becomes, why? Because undecideds represent uncertainty. There's how they assign themselves. Even 60-40 in that case would change, even if the poll was perfectly accurate at that time, 40-34, if those remaining 26% of undecided voters, or even just 60-40 split, it can change the election outcome. I'm doing the math in my head right now as they speak, as we go 15, and it'll be very, very close. But regardless, we understand that the 50-50 split, which is what the current methods in the United States assume, is not in a race, assuming that the race will continue as it has progressed to this point, is a perfectly valid assumption, but you cannot assume your assumption can't be wrong. Perfect. Which is the current state of things.
I want to give you a chance to let us know how we can find you, the Substack, the book, buy the book, etc. But first, do you have any questions for me?
I knew you were going to put me on the spot like this.
I did, yeah.
And I'm trying to think of some way to tie in things we've talked about, our mutual interests. What role do you think science and statistics can play in how we approach conversations with people? Because this is something that I honestly struggle with. My belief in science is that we should try to find things that are closer to the truth. I don't like to use the capital T truth in science because we know science can be modified, improved, right? One of the quotes that I wrote down here, science is not a collection of data, but a continued improvement of how we can explain what the data means. One of the things that I struggle with, and people say I come across direct, rude, conceited, all of these different things. And it's because my belief is that science should be about finding something closer to what is true, what is accurate, and what is valuable, I guess, in terms of methodologies. So how do you think that we can use science or statistics? Are there any interesting studies that you've seen recently about how I can get people to like me more?
Well, so
okay, let's not make it personal. Let's not make it personal.
No, that's okay.
Let's just say how we can approach conversations in a way that people are not offended by talking about things that are serious or emotional.
Yeah. So one possibility that comes to mind is the work that Mike Madrid and Chuck Rocha have done on Latino voters. In survey after survey, poll after poll, what they've found is that the top 3 to 4 most important issues all have to do with economic issues, cost of living, employment opportunities, wages, economic issues. And yet, whether it's day-to-day conversations, if I sit down with my friend who's from Puerto Rico or my friend who's from Mexico, I might want to talk to them about immigration. And while that may be on the list somewhere, it's 4th or 5th on the list in poll after poll, survey after survey of priorities. So why am I banging away at or identity issues? Right. Why am I banging away at you should be using the word Latinx? They don't give a shit about it. They don't care about, like, I mean, not they, 100% of they, but I mean, that's
Right,
another
right.
way to think about it, is that maybe I'm sitting down with the person who really is into Latinx,
Mhm.
first generation or second generation Mexican American, and maybe that's important to them. But if we're using science and we're using the tools to inform us, poll after poll, survey after survey indicates that the top 3 or 4 issues are all economic issues. They're not identity issues, not even immigration issues. Although immigration is on the list, it's fourth or fifth on the list. So I don't know.
Right.
Is that helpful?
Yeah. I think sometimes what we think matters to people isn't the most important thing to them. And in my experience, I have come across that as well,
Yeah.
is that, hey, I have this very good research. I've cited a lot of sources and I've presented some mathematical formulas, things that can be evaluated for truth. And for whatever reason, people that I think should be interested in these topics, for whatever reason, they just don't resonate.
Yeah.
So I think my job, I guess, and what I'll take away from that is I have to make it important. I have to make it resonate. Um,
Yeah, or you
so
could do a really quick poll. If your entire polling field is one person, you could just ask them, what's important to you,
yeah,
as
yeah,
opposed to assuming based on the polls that you've read that this is what's important and this is what's important. This is how you think because this is what I don't know skin color you have or this is where your parents
right.
are from or whatever. But that is one way that we can use science to at least give us a directional, some sort of direction.
Yeah.
All right, so how can we follow you? Find more information. The book is "The Polls Weren't Wrong." I read chunks of it again leading up to this. The Substack. Yeah, how can we find it all and make sure to keep up with all your great work?
The polls weren't wrong is available anywhere books are sold. I don't know what else to say. You can buy it direct from the publisher. You can buy on Amazon. Ebooks are available. If you connected with my words, the way I think, the way I presented problems, you will really, really, really like the book. The book outlines things step by step by step. It starts at the very fundamentals of what polls do. It's not too long. There's not too much jargon. Honestly, there's not even too much math because there doesn't need to be that much math at the fundamental level. As it goes on, the things that people really want to know about, the 2016 Trump versus Clinton election. How can I say with such confidence the polls weren't wrong? That's outlined in the book. I also talk about Brexit. To our point earlier, Brexit, much like the California Prop 50 referendum, 2 options, yes or no, stay or leave. These are very easy to model, voter preferences, and you can guess what happened with Brexit because the prevailing consensus was that they would probably stay. The polls said stay was ahead by some number, 4, 5, 8 points. And then, oh no, they left. I wonder what confounding variable could account for a large portion of that error. And we talk about many U.S. elections, a
And
little bit of
Mintucky.
history. Mint Tucky, oh, that's a good one. My little experiment to illustrate, and again to help educate people who would like to be educated on this topic, how to think about poll data, how to quantify uncertainty, things like that. Polls weren't wrong. Wonderful book. Highly recommended. It's highly recommended by a lot of people, by the way. I don't talk about that enough because I want my work to stand on its own merits. But Mike Madrid endorsed it. Some pretty prominent analysts have endorsed it. So there's a lot in there. Whether or not you care deeply like I do about science and education, there's a lot in there that I think any of your listeners would find valuable. And if you're kind of on the fence, my Substack at Real Carl Allen, I write on there. I talk a little bit in bite-sized pieces about these different topics: the simultaneous census, ideal polls, the spread method versus the proportional method, the different methods used by analysts around the world to measure poll accuracy, how these methods are inherently contradictory, and yet there's some sort of mathematical unspeakable truce between the two, even though they're irreconcilable. I don't claim to know the minds of these people. I'm just trying to do proper science to the extent that I can. And if you would like to talk to me, ask me questions, you can reach me on other social medias. Threads is where I'm most active. but I am still on X. I now have a TikTok. I occasionally make videos on TikTok and Instagram,
That's awesome.
mostly nerd stuff, but I do talk about elections. I just made a video about the mayoral election, and what happened with the disappearing Sliwa vote went to Cuomo. But the margin of the poll, the margins were good.
Yeah.
Don't get me started right now. If you guys would like to join me in my quest to improve statistical literacy, scientific literacy, and to help people understand the value that these tools can provide us and the inability of these tools to provide us the certainty that we so crave, please follow me on social medias, follow me on Substack, and if you really, really want to support me, buy my book.
Awesome. Carl, this is so much fun, man. Like I said, we were saying before I hit record that I feel like I've been keeping up with you and been talking because I digest so much of your content, but it's really
Yeah,
cool sitting down with you. Thanks for doing this, man. This is really great.
absolutely, man. Thanks for having me. I will come back anytime. Yeah,
Awesome.
anytime.
Awesome. We'll do poker next. We'll just have an hour on poker.
I
Maybe
I
that'll be
am
our
I am
shared podcast. We'll do poker.
I'm literally sitting at my poker table as we speak, and I would show it to you, but it's a little bit of a mess
Okay.
because I had a some friends over a couple days ago. We played some card games, Pai Gow,
Wow.
different things,
Wow.
little easier games to talk through than poker.
Perfect. Perfect. All right. And as always, thank you again to Maze Wealth Management and the Village Square. Really appreciate those folks for helping us keep the lights on. If you dig what we're doing here, remember to follow this show, write the review. The reviews still really matter. Apple Podcast and Spotify and everywhere else. You can watch conversations on YouTube, youtube.com/ at politics and religion. And I am at Corey S. Nathan on all the socials, COREYS as in Sam, NATHAN at Corey S. Nathan, including Substack. Now go talk some politics and religion with gentleness and respect, and have a great week.